Tale of Werewolves, Alphas, and Fated Destinies, written by Olivia Stone. The moment Celine Stormborn walked into the Grand Hall at Silver Peak Mountain Lodge, she knew this year's Alpha Summit was going to be different from the previous 5 she had attended, though she could not have predicted just how catastrophically different it would become, or how the events of this single evening would unravel every carefully constructed wall she had built around her heart over the past 7 years since she had clawed her way to becoming the youngest female alpha in living memory. The massive stone fireplace at the far end of the hall blazed with flames that cast dancing shadows across the assembled alphas, 20 of the most powerful wolves in the Northern Territories, all gathered in this neutral ground to discuss territorial agreements, trade routes, and the ever-present threat of rogue attacks that had been increasing with alarming frequency over the past year. And as Celine moved through the crowd with her beta Kira at her left side and her twin brothers Theo and Lucas flanking her right, she could feel the weight of judgmental stares following her every step, could hear the whispered comments that had plagued her since she first claimed her father's position at the impossibly young age of 20. Her long silver hair, inherited from her mother's ancient bloodline, and flowing down to her waist in waves that caught the firelight and seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly glow, marked her as different even among werewolves, and her striking amber gold eyes that could shift to a predatory gleam when her alpha power rose to the surface had always made other wolves uncomfortable, as if they could see the grief and determination and barely controlled fury that she carried in her soul like shards of broken glass. She wore her usual attire for these summits, black leather pants that allowed for quick movement if a fight broke out, which happened more often than the council liked to admit, and a deep green tunic that brought out the gold in her eyes, with her father's alpha ring on her right hand, the only piece of jewelry she ever wore, and the only physical reminder she allowed herself of the parents who had died protecting their pack from a rogue attack that had decimated everything she loved and left her responsible for 50 traumatized survivors who had looked to a 19-year-old girl to save them. The other alphas, most of them male, and all of them older than her current 26 years, watched her approach the registration table with expressions that ranged from dismissive amusement to outright hostility, and she could hear their thoughts as clearly as if they had spoken them aloud because she had heard variations of the same sentiments for 6 years now. The little girl, Alpha, they called her behind her back, and sometimes to her face, the orphan who thinks she can lead, the female who should have stepped aside and let a proper male alpha take control of Stormcrest Pack, instead of stubbornly clinging to a position she was too weak and too emotional to handle effectively. And every single one of those whispered insults made her jaw clench tighter and her alpha aura flare just a little bit stronger, because she had rebuilt her pack from 50 broken survivors to 300 thriving members through sheer determination and countless sleepless nights. And she would be damned if she let anyone make her feel ashamed of what she had accomplished through blood and tears, and a refusal to give up, even when giving up would have been so much easier than continuing to fight. Kira, her best friend since childhood and the fiercest warrior Celine had ever known, leaned in close and whispered with barely contained irritation that was evident in the way her brown eyes flashed with protective anger. "If Alpha Marcus makes one more comment about how you should consider taking a mate to help you lead properly, I am going to remove his tongue and feed it to the ravens. And I do not care if it causes a territorial incident, because some insults cannot be tolerated even in the name of diplomatic peace." Celine allowed herself a small smile at her beta's fierce loyalty, one of the few genuine smiles that ever crossed her face these days, since smiling felt like a luxury she could not afford when she had an entire pack depending on her to keep them safe and fed and protected from the dangers that lurked in every shadow. She had just opened her mouth to tell Kira that removing Alpha Marcus's tongue would probably improve his conversation skills considerably, when the massive oak doors at the entrance to the hall swung open with such force that they slammed against the stone walls with a sound like thunder, and every single conversation in the room died instantly, as if someone had cut all the threads of sound with a silver blade, because the presence that walked through those doors was so overwhelmingly powerful that even the strongest alphas in the room felt their wolves whimper and lower their heads in instinctive submission to a dominance that transcended normal pack hierarchy and touched something ancient and primal in their very souls. Celine turned with everyone else to see who had arrived with such dramatic timing, and the moment her amber gold eyes locked onto the figure standing in the doorway, she felt something inside her chest snap into place with such violent force that she actually gasped out loud and had to grab Kira's arm to keep herself from stumbling, because the mate bond that she had heard about in stories and legends but had never experienced herself suddenly slammed into her awareness like a tidal wave of sensation and emotion and desperate, aching need that threatened to drown her where she stood. The Alpha King Demon Silvercrown stood in the entrance to the hall like a conquering war god carved from moonlight and shadows, his silver hair that fell to his shoulders marking him as royalty. From the ancient bloodlines that had ruled the northern territories for 1,000 years, and his ice-blue eyes that seemed to glow with an inner light swept across the assembled alphas with the casual confidence of someone who had never doubted his right to command and had never needed to prove his worth to anyone because his power simply was as natural and undeniable as the rising of the moon. He was tall, easily 6.5 feet of solid muscle and controlled strength, with broad shoulders that filled the doorway and a presence that made the massive hall suddenly feel too small to contain him. And he wore simple but expensive clothing, black pants and a dark blue shirt that brought out the ice in his eyes, with no crown or royal regalia, because he did not need symbols of authority when his very existence proclaimed his status more effectively than any crown ever could. Celine felt her wolf, the animal spirit that lived within her soul and shared her consciousness, suddenly throw back her head and howl with desperate longing and recognition. The internal sound so loud and so overwhelming that it drowned out every rational thought in Celine's mind and left only one word echoing through her consciousness, like a prayer and a curse, and a destiny she had never asked for but could not deny. Mate, mate, mate. She could feel him through the bond that had snapped into place between them, like a golden thread of fate woven by the moon goddess herself, could sense his emotions as if they were her own, and what she felt radiating from him was shock, and then fierce, possessive satisfaction, and then a determination so absolute that it terrified her more than any rogue attack ever had, because she knew, with sudden, horrible certainty, that this male would not be denied, would not be put off, would not accept rejection or refusal, or any of the carefully constructed walls she had built around her heart to keep herself safe from the vulnerability that love and connection demanded. His eyes found hers across the crowded hall with the inevitability of a magnet finding true north. And Celine watched as his ice-blue gaze widened slightly in recognition before darkening with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat and her heart pound so hard against her ribs that she thought it might actually break through bone and flesh in its desperate attempt to reach the mate that fate had finally revealed to her after 26 years of waiting. The silver hair connection was not lost on anyone in the room, she realized with growing horror, because ancient pack law and older legends spoke of silver-haired wolves being destined for greatness, for power, for bonds that would change the shape of territories and alter the course of history. And here stood 2 silver-haired alphas staring at each other across a hall full of witnesses as the mate bond crackled between them with such visible intensity that several wolves actually took a step back as if they could feel the power radiating from the connection like heat from a forge. Demon Silvercrown began walking toward her with slow, deliberate steps that ate up the distance between them with the predatory grace of a wolf who had already claimed his prey and was simply allowing her the illusion of freedom before he made his final move, and Celine's mind raced with panic and terror, and a desperate need to run that warred with an equally desperate need to close the remaining distance between them and throw herself into his arms and accept the bond that was singing through her veins like the most addictive drug she had ever encountered. But running toward him was not an option, could never be an option, because accepting this bond meant accepting vulnerability and weakness and the terrifying possibility of loss that had defined her entire adult life since the night she had watched her parents die, protecting the pack they loved, since the night she had held her mother's broken body and felt her father's final breath against her tear-stained cheek, since the night she had looked into her 13-year-old brother's eyes and promised them that she would keep them safe no matter what it cost her, even if it meant sacrificing every chance at personal happiness she might ever have. The memory of that night crashed over her with the force of a physical blow, and suddenly she was 19 again and covered in her parents' blood, watching as her father fought off 3 rogues while trying to protect her mother, watching as distraction and love and the need to keep his mate safe made him lower his guard for just one crucial second, watching as a rogue's claws tore out his throat while her mother screamed and launched herself at their attacker with no thought for her own safety because her mate was dying and nothing else mattered anymore. Not the pack or the territory or even her own children who needed her, only the male who was bleeding out on the forest floor and taking her heart with him into the darkness. That was what the mate bond did to you. Celine's terrified mind screamed at her as Demon continued his inexorable approach. That was what love and connection and vulnerability cost. The ability to think rationally, the ability to protect yourself and your pack, the ability to make the hard choices that leadership demanded because you were too busy protecting your mate, or mourning your mate, or being distracted by your mate. And she could not afford that weakness, could not allow that vulnerability, could not risk becoming like her mother, who had thrown away her life for love and left her children orphaned and her pack leaderless, and her daughter drowning in responsibilities that no 19-year-old should have had to shoulder alone. So Celine made a choice, the same choice she had been making for 7 years every time her heart tried to open, and every time her wolf begged for connection, and every time she felt the bone-deep loneliness that came from holding everyone at arm's length, because letting them close meant giving them the power to destroy her. And she raised her hand in a gesture that stopped Demon in his tracks halfway across the hall, raised her chin with the defiant pride that had kept her alive through countless challenges and battles and political maneuvering that would have broken a weaker wolf, and spoke in a voice that carried across the suddenly silent hall with perfect clarity and absolute conviction, even though her wolf was howling in protest and her heart was shattering into pieces that she knew she would never be able to put back together again. I, Celine Stormborn, Alpha of Stormcrest Pack, reject the mate bond, she declared, and the words felt like poison on her tongue and acid in her throat. But she forced them out anyway, because rejecting the bond now was easier than accepting it and losing him later, because pushing him away before she got attached was safer than letting him close and watching him die because she was distracted or weak or too much in love to make the hard choices that would keep him alive. The gasps that rippled through the assembled alphas were nothing compared to the shock that froze Demon's handsome face. The ice-blue eyes widening in disbelief before narrowing with an emotion that Celine could not quite identify through the bond that was now screaming in protest at her rejection. And she forced herself to continue speaking, even though every word felt like she was tearing out pieces of her own soul and throwing them at his feet in a desperate attempt to make him leave before she changed her mind and gave in to the desperate need that was threatening to overwhelm her completely. I don't need a mate. I don't want a mate, and I certainly don't need an alpha king trying to control my life or my pack or making me weak with distraction and emotion and all the vulnerability that comes with accepting a bond that I never asked for and do not want, she said. And she knew the words were cruel, knew they were cutting him with the same vicious precision that she used in battle when she was fighting for her life. But cruel words now would save them both from greater pain. Later, when the inevitable happened, and she lost him the way she had lost everyone else she had ever loved. The shock on Demon's face transformed slowly into something else, something that made Selena's breath catch despite her determination to remain unmoved, because instead of anger or hurt or the wounded pride she had expected to see, his expression shifted into a slow, dangerous smile that held promises and threats and an absolute confidence that terrified her more than his anger ever could have. And when he spoke, his voice was quiet enough that only those closest to them could hear. But the words carried the weight of an alpha's command and the certainty of a male who had never been denied anything he truly wanted in his entire life. "You can reject it all you want, Celine Stormborn," he said. His ice-blue eyes locked on hers with an intensity that pinned her in place more effectively than any physical restraint. "But the bond doesn't work that way. The moon goddess doesn't make mistakes, and you are already mine whether you accept it right now or spend the next year running from a truth that both of us can feel burning between us like wildfire." He took another step closer, closing the distance she had tried to create, and Celine found herself frozen in place, unable to move or speak or do anything except stare into those ice-blue eyes that saw through every wall she had built and every lie she told herself about not needing anyone or anything beyond her pack and her duty and her determination to never be vulnerable again. "You just don't know it yet," he finished softly. The words a promise and a threat and a prophecy all rolled into one. "But you will, and when you finally stop running and accept what we both know is inevitable, I will be right here waiting to claim what has always been mine from the moment the moon goddess decided to give me a silver-haired, amber-eyed, absolutely terrified female alpha who thinks she can protect herself from fate by rejecting the one person who could actually make her stronger instead of weaker." Celine felt something crack inside her chest at his words, felt the first tendril of doubt creep into her certainty that rejection was the only safe choice. But she could not afford doubt, could not afford to question her decision, could not afford to stand here in this hall full of witnesses and let him see how desperately she wanted to take back her rejection and throw herself into his arms and accept the bond that was still singing between them despite her attempt to sever it. So instead of answering, instead of acknowledging the truth in his words, or the way her wolf was clawing at her insides, begging her to submit to their mate and accept the gift the moon goddess had given them, Celine turned on her heel with every ounce of alpha authority she possessed and walked toward the exit with her head held high and her spine straight. Kira and her brothers scrambling to follow her as she left the hall, and the alpha summit, and the silver-haired male who watched her go with ice-blue eyes that promised this was far from over. And as she stepped out into the winter night, where a storm was beginning to gather in the mountains, like a physical manifestation of the turmoil raging in her heart, Celine Stormborn wondered if she had just made the biggest mistake of her life, and if rejecting her mate to keep herself safe from vulnerability had actually been the most vulnerable thing she could possibly have done. The 3 days following the Alpha Summit were the worst 3 days of Celine Stormborn's entire life, and considering that her life had included watching her parents die in front of her, raising 2 teenage brothers while barely more than a teenager herself, and fighting off more rogue attacks than she could count on both hands, that was saying something significant about just how catastrophically her attempt to reject the mate bond had backfired in ways she could never have anticipated or prepared for, despite all her careful planning and determination to remain unattached and invulnerable to the weaknesses that came with loving someone more than you loved your own survival. She had returned to Stormcrest territory immediately after walking out of the summit, had driven through the night with Kira silent and disapproving in the passenger seat, and her brothers unusually quiet in the back of the vehicle, all of them processing what had just happened in that grand hall at Silver Peak Mountain Lodge. All of them knowing that Celine had just publicly rejected the most powerful alpha in the Northern Territories, and that there would be consequences for such an unprecedented act of defiance, though none of them could have predicted just how personal and devastating those consequences would become. The physical pain had started almost immediately, a dull ache in her chest that felt like someone had wrapped iron bands around her ribcage and was slowly tightening them with each passing hour, making it difficult to breathe deeply or sleep soundly, or focus on anything except the constant awareness that something essential was missing from her life. Something she had rejected before she could fully understand what she was giving up. And her wolf was absolutely furious with her, snarling and snapping inside her mind, with a rage that Celine had never experienced from her animal counterpart in all the years they had shared consciousness and worked together to lead their pack and survive the countless dangers that came with being a young female alpha in a world that did not particularly want or respect female alphas. She tried to ignore the pain and the fury of her wolf and the strange, unsettling sensation of feeling emotions that were not quite her own, echoes of frustration and determination and a possessive satisfaction that made her skin prickle with awareness. Because she knew, somehow knew, with absolute certainty, that those emotions belonged to Demon Silvercrown and were bleeding through a mate bond that should not have been able to form, given that she had rejected it publicly and clearly, and with all the conviction she could muster. But the bond was there anyway, a golden thread connecting her consciousness to his, that she could feel thrumming with life and energy every time she closed her eyes or let her guard down for even a moment. And through that unwanted connection, she could sense him out there somewhere in the world, could feel his presence like a compass needle always pointing north, could catch glimpses of his emotional state that ranged from angry to amused to absolutely determined in ways that made her profoundly nervous about what he might be planning. Kira had tried to talk to her about it on the second day, had cornered Celine in her office where she was attempting and failing to focus on supply requisitions and border patrol schedules, and her beta's brown eyes had been full of concern and frustration and the kind of blunt honesty that came from a friendship forged in childhood and strengthened through years of fighting side by side against every challenge the world had thrown at them. "You rejected the Alpha King?" Kira had said, and even though it was not a question, Celine had heard the disbelief and worry underlying every word, the unspoken question of what in the name of the moon goddess had Celine been thinking when she publicly humiliated the most powerful male in their world. And more importantly, what did she plan to do now that the deed was done and could not be taken back without losing face and appearing weak and indecisive? which were qualities no alpha could afford to display if they wanted to maintain their authority and keep their pack safe from challenges and territorial disputes. "I had to," Celine had responded, though the words sounded hollow even to her own ears, and she had found herself rubbing absently at the ache in her chest that seemed to be growing stronger with each passing hour, as if the rejected bond was physically manifesting its displeasure at being denied, and was determined to make her suffer for her choice until she either gave in or went mad from the constant pain. "You saw him, Kira. You felt his presence. And you know as well as I do that accepting a mate bond means accepting vulnerability and distraction and all the weaknesses that come with caring about someone more than you care about yourself. And I cannot afford that. Not when I have 300 wolves depending on me to keep them safe and fed and protected from rogues and rival packs and all the other dangers that exist in this world." Kira had looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was equal parts sympathy and exasperation. And then she had said something that had made Celine's carefully constructed arguments crumble like sand castles before a tide. Had said the one thing that Celine had been trying desperately not to think about ever since she walked out of that hall and left her mate standing there with shock and determination written across his devastatingly handsome face. "Your parents didn't die because they loved each other, Celine," Kira had said softly, her voice gentle but uncompromising in its honesty, the kind of truth that cut deeper than any blade because it came from someone who genuinely cared and was willing to risk anger and rejection to say what needed to be said. "They died because rogues attacked our territory and they fought to protect their pack. And yes, your father was trying to keep your mother safe, but he would have fought just as fiercely even if she hadn't been there. Because that's what alphas do. That's what leaders do. And you dishonor their memory by using their deaths as an excuse to avoid living your own life fully and accepting the gifts the moon goddess sees fit to give you." The words had struck Celine like physical blows, and she had opened her mouth to argue, to defend her choices, to explain that Kira did not understand the weight of responsibility that came with leadership or the terror of loving someone so much that losing them would break you beyond repair. But before she could form a coherent response, a commotion at her office door had interrupted them, and one of her border patrol wolves had burst into the room with barely controlled excitement and announced that a delivery had arrived at the main gate, a massive package addressed specifically to Alpha Celine Stormborn, with a royal seal that everyone recognized as belonging to the Alpha King himself. Celine had felt her heart skip a beat and then start racing with a combination of anxiety and anticipation that she absolutely refused to acknowledge as she followed the patrol wolf to the main entrance of her pack house, where indeed there was an enormous wooden crate being unloaded by a royal courier who wore the silver and blue colors of the Northern Crown pack, and who bowed respectfully when Celine approached. Though she noticed that his eyes held a hint of amusement that suggested he knew exactly what was in the crate, and found the entire situation entertaining in ways that made her want to snarl at him. The crate, when opened, revealed silver moonflowers, dozens and dozens of the rare blooms that only grew in the highest mountain peaks, and only bloomed once a year under the light of the full moon. Flowers that were so difficult to obtain that most wolves went their entire lives without ever seeing one in person, and nestled among the silver petals was a note written in elegant masculine handwriting that made something in Celine's chest clench with an emotion she could not quite name and absolutely refused to identify as longing. "For my mate," the note read, the words stark and simple and absolute in their certainty. "Whether you accept it or not, you're mine to court, and I have never been one to give up on something I want simply because the path to obtaining it is difficult or the prize insists on running away from destiny. And you, Celine Stormborn, are the most valuable prize I have ever pursued, worth every moment of patience and every act of courtship, and every breath I take from this moment until you finally stop being so stubborn and admit what we both already know to be true. The note was signed simply with a D that somehow managed to convey arrogance and affection and absolute determination all in a single letter, and Celine had stared at it for so long that Kira had finally taken it from her trembling fingers and read it herself before looking up at Celine with an expression that clearly said, "I told you so," without needing to speak the words aloud. "Throw them out," Celine had ordered, her voice sharper than she intended, rough with emotions she could not afford to feel and did not want to acknowledge. "Throw them all out? I don't want them. I don't want anything from him. And I certainly don't want him thinking that expensive gifts are going to change my mind about a bond I have already rejected." But her brothers Theo and Lucas had intervened before Kira could carry out the order, had carefully rescued the moonflowers from their inevitable destruction, and had given Celine matching looks of disappointment and exasperation that reminded her uncomfortably of the expressions her parents used to wear when she was being particularly stubborn as a child. And Theo had said, with the kind of gentle firmness that he had developed over years of dealing with his sister's tendency to push everyone away, "He's the Alpha King, Celine. You can't just reject him publicly and expect him to disappear like some love-struck teenage wolf who got turned down for a dance at the Harvest Festival. And besides, these flowers are beautiful and rare and probably cost more than our entire pack's monthly budget, so we're keeping them." The flowers had been placed in the main hall where everyone could see them, a constant reminder of the mate bond she had rejected, and the male who apparently had no intention of accepting her rejection. And over the next several days, more gifts arrived with such frequency that Celine began to suspect Demon had assigned someone specifically to the task of courting her through strategic present giving. There were books on pack management and territory expansion that showed he had actually paid attention to her interests and concerns rather than simply sending generic romantic gifts. There were rare healing herbs for her pack's medical supplies that demonstrated knowledge of Stormcrest's specific needs and challenges. There were toys and games for the pack's children that arrived with notes suggesting that Demon understood the importance of investing in the next generation and building a pack that thrived rather than simply survived, and each gift came with a note that ranged from playful to serious, but always carried the underlying message that he was not giving up, that he would wait as long as necessary, that she could run, but she could not hide from a bond that the moon goddess herself had forged between their souls. Celine had tried to refuse them all, had ordered her pack members to return every package, but her orders were being undermined at every turn by wolves who were charmed by the Alpha King's persistence, and who seemed to think that their alpha deserved happiness and love, even if she was too stubborn to accept it herself. And she had realized with growing frustration that Demon was not just courting her, he was systematically winning over her entire pack, making them complicit in his pursuit and ensuring that she would face resistance from her own people if she continued to reject his advances. But it was not the gifts that truly broke through her defenses, was not the flowers or the books or the thoughtful gestures that showed he understood her in ways that made her deeply uncomfortable. It was the night of the 6th day when she woke from a nightmare that had plagued her since her parents' death, the familiar terror of watching them die while being powerless to save them, the crushing guilt of surviving when they had not, the overwhelming responsibility of keeping everyone else alive when she had failed to protect the two people she loved most in the world. She had woken gasping and covered in cold sweat, with tears streaming down her face and her wolf howling with grief inside her mind. And for the first time since the summit, she had not been alone with her pain and fear and guilt, because through the mate bond, she could feel Demon's consciousness brush against hers like a gentle hand smoothing away the worst of the nightmare's lingering effects. Could feel his concern and his desire to comfort, and his absolute certainty that she was strong enough to carry whatever burdens life had given her, but that she did not have to carry them alone anymore if she would just let him help. The sensation had been so overwhelming and so comforting and so terrifying in its intimacy that Celine had done something she never did, had reached back through the bond instinctively before she could stop herself, had let herself lean into that offered comfort for just a moment before her walls slammed back into place and she severed the connection with enough force that she felt Demon's surprise and disappointment echo through the bond before she managed to block him out completely. She had spent the rest of that night sitting in her office with her head in her hands, trying to understand how rejecting the bond had somehow made it stronger, trying to figure out why pushing him away seemed to only draw him closer, trying desperately to maintain her conviction that staying alone was safer than accepting love when every fiber of her being was screaming that she had made a terrible mistake and that she was going to lose something infinitely precious if she did not find the courage to reverse course before it was too late. It was on the 7th day after the summit, exactly 1 week after she had rejected him in front of 20 witnesses and walked away convinced that she was protecting herself and her pack from inevitable heartbreak, that everything changed in ways that Celine could never have anticipated and that would force her to confront every fear and every wall and every carefully constructed defense mechanism she had spent 7 years building to protect herself from vulnerability. The attack came at dawn, which should have been her first warning that this was not a random rogue incursion, but a carefully planned assault designed to catch her pack at their most vulnerable moment when the night shift guards were tired and the day shift had not yet taken their positions and everyone was still half asleep and unprepared for the violence that suddenly erupted across multiple points along her territory's borders. Celine had been in the training grounds working through sword forms to clear her mind and exhaust her body enough that she might actually sleep without nightmares when the first alarm howl went up, followed immediately by several more from different directions, and she had known instantly from the coordination and the timing that this was not the usual disorganized rogue attack, but something far more dangerous and far more deliberate. She had shifted immediately, her clothes tearing away as her body transformed into her silver wolf form that was larger and more powerful than most female wolves, but still smaller than the male alphas she would inevitably have to fight, and she had run toward the nearest point of attack with her heart pounding and her alpha instincts screaming at her to protect her pack, to save her people, to do whatever was necessary to keep everyone safe, even if it meant sacrificing herself in the process, because that was what alphas did. That was what leaders did, and she would rather die fighting than live knowing she had failed the wolves who depended on her. The battle that followed was brutal and chaotic and terrifyingly one-sided, because there were not just a handful of rogues as she had initially thought, but dozens of them. 50 or more attackers who were working together with a level of coordination that suggested someone had trained them and organized them and pointed them specifically at Stormcrest territory with the intention of overwhelming her defenses and destroying everything she had spent 6 years building. She fought with everything she had, her jaws snapping and her claws tearing through flesh as she moved through the battlefield like a silver whirlwind of teeth and fury. But for every rogue she took down, 2 more seemed to appear, and she could see her warriors falling around her, could hear the screams of pack members who were not trained fighters being attacked in their homes, could feel through her alpha bond with her pack that they were losing. that they were being pushed back toward the central pack house where the children and elderly had been evacuated, that they were minutes away from being completely overrun. She saw Theo go down under 3 rogues, watched in horror as they tore into him with vicious efficiency, and something inside her broke at the sight of her brother's blood staining the ground. Her baby brother, who she had raised and protected and promised would always be safe as long as she drew breath, and she threw herself toward him with a howl of rage and desperation that cut through the sounds of battle like a blade through silk. She managed to kill 2 of the rogues attacking Theo and drive off the 3rd, but not before they had inflicted wounds that were severe enough that she knew he needed immediate medical attention if he was going to survive. And she stood over his broken body with her teeth bared and her hackles raised, daring anyone to try to finish what they had started, but there were too many of them. Far too many. And she could see Lucas in the distance, surrounded by rogues and Kira, fighting back to back with 2 other warriors against impossible odds. And Selene realized with cold, terrible clarity that this was it. This was how Stormcrest Pack would end, not with honor or glory, but with overwhelming numbers and coordinated violence, and her own stubborn pride that had prevented her from forming alliances or accepting help because she had been so determined to prove she could do everything alone. Her pride warred with her love for her pack. Her determination to remain independent fought against her desperate need to save the wolves who depended on her. And she stood there over Theo's bleeding body, with rogues closing in from all sides, and made a choice that felt like tearing out her own heart, made a decision that went against everything she had convinced herself was necessary for survival and safety, and maintaining the walls that kept her protected from vulnerability and loss. She threw back her head and howled, not the alarm howl or the battle cry or any of the normal pack communications, but something deeper and more primal, something she had never done before, because doing it meant admitting need and accepting help and acknowledging that she could not handle everything alone, no matter how strong or capable or determined she was. It was a mate call, carried not through sound, but through the bond she had tried so hard to reject, a desperate plea sent directly to Demon's consciousness wherever he was, and the moment she released it, she felt his response like lightning through her veins, felt his shock, and then his absolute fury at the danger she was in, and then his determination as he began moving toward her with a speed that should have been impossible given that he was hundreds of miles away in his own territory. But she had called him, had reached for him through the bond she had rejected, had admitted through action, if not words, that she needed him, that she wanted him, that she could not survive this alone no matter how much she wished she could. And Demon Silvercrown was coming for his mate with all the wrath and power and possessive protectiveness of an alpha king who had just been given permission to claim what had always been his. And Selene could only hope that he would arrive in time to save her pack from destruction and her from the rogues who were now circling her and Theo with death in their eyes and victory within their grasp. The 30 minutes between Selene's desperate mate call through the bond and Demon's actual arrival felt like an eternity stretched across the sharp edge of a blade, each second dragging out into an infinity of blood and pain, and the terrible certainty that she had waited too long to ask for help, had clung to her pride and her fear for so long that the price would be paid in the lives of wolves she had sworn to protect. And she fought with a desperation born of grief and rage and the crushing weight of responsibility that came with being an alpha who had failed her pack through her own stubborn refusal to accept that strength sometimes meant knowing when to ask for help rather than insisting on bearing every burden alone. She stood over Theo's unconscious body with her silver fur matted with blood that was both hers and belonging to the rogues she had killed, her amber eyes blazing with alpha power as she faced down the circle of enemies that surrounded her with their teeth bared and their eyes gleaming with the kind of madness that came from living outside pack law for so long that they had forgotten what it meant to be civilized wolves rather than simple monsters wearing wolf skins. And she knew that these next few moments would determine whether Stormcrest Pack survived or whether everything she had built over 6 years of blood and sweat and sleepless nights would be torn apart by creatures who valued nothing except violence and chaos and the destruction of anything that represented order and safety and the bonds of family that held packs together. She could feel Demon getting closer through the mate bond that thrummed between them like a living thing, could sense his fury and his fear for her safety, and his absolute determination to reach her before the rogues could finish what they had started. And that awareness gave her the strength to keep fighting, even as her muscles screamed with exhaustion, and her wounds bled freely, and her wolf howled inside her mind that they could not hold out much longer against these odds, that they were going to fall and die here in the dirt defending their brother's body, while their pack was torn apart around them. But then she felt it, a shift in the air and a sudden pressure that made every wolf on the battlefield pause mid-attack and turn toward the territory line where something massive and powerful and absolutely furious was approaching with a speed that defied normal wolf capabilities. And Celine watched through blood-blurred vision as a silver wolf that was easily twice the size of any normal alpha burst through the tree line at the edge of her territory, followed by what looked like 20 of the largest warriors she had ever seen, all of them wearing the distinctive silver-blue aura that marked them as members of the Northern Crown Pack's elite guard, all of them moving with the kind of coordinated precision that came from years of training together and fighting together and trusting each other with their lives. Demon Silver Crown in his wolf form was a sight that would have stolen Celine's breath if she had any breath left to steal, because he was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure. His silver fur gleaming like moonlight given physical form, and his ice-blue eyes burning with an inner fire that promised death to anyone who had dared to threaten his mate. And when he threw back his head and released a howl that contained all his rage and possessiveness and alpha dominance compressed into a single note of pure power, every rogue on the battlefield froze for a crucial second as their instincts screamed at them to submit or flee from a predator so far above them in the hierarchy of power that fighting him would be nothing less than suicide. That second of frozen terror was all Demon and his elite guard needed to turn the tide of the battle, and they tore into the rogues with the efficiency and brutality that made it clear they were not just warriors, but instruments of the Alpha King's will, extensions of his power and his fury, and his absolute refusal to allow anyone to harm what belonged to him. And Celine watched through a haze of exhaustion and relief and emotions too complex to name, as her mate fought his way across the battlefield toward her, cutting down rogues with ruthless precision, while his guards spread out to protect the vulnerable members of her pack and drive back the attackers who had been on the verge of overwhelming her defenses completely. Demon reached her within minutes, positioning himself between Celine and the remaining rogues with a growl that vibrated through the ground beneath their feet and made even the most battle-crazed attackers reconsider their odds of survival. And Celine felt something inside her chest unlock at the sight of him standing there like a silver guardian carved from moonlight and fury, protecting her and her brother and her pack with the same fierce dedication she had always thought she needed to maintain alone, because accepting help meant accepting weakness. They fought side by side for the next 20 minutes, and it was like nothing Celine had ever experienced before, because their movements synchronized perfectly without any verbal communication. Her instincts anticipating his attacks and his positioning, complementing her defense in ways that went beyond training or strategy and touched something primal in the mate bond that connected them, as if their wolves had been designed by the moon goddess specifically to work together as a single devastating unit that was far more effective than either of them could have been fighting alone. The rogues began to flee once they realized they were facing not just a larger force, but a force led by the Alpha King himself, and Demon's guards pursued them to the borders and beyond, ensuring that none would survive to report back to whoever had organized this attack or to return with reinforcements that might threaten Celine's territory again. And gradually the sounds of battle faded and were replaced by the groans of wounded wolves and the howls of grief from those who had lost pack members, and the general chaos that always followed combat when the adrenaline wore off and wolves were left to assess the damage and count the cost of survival. Celine shifted back to human form the moment the immediate danger passed, her body protesting the transformation after so much fighting and blood loss, and she collapsed to her knees beside Theo's still form, with her hands shaking as she checked his pulse and his breathing and assessed his wounds with the kind of clinical detachment that was the only thing keeping her from breaking down completely. Demon shifted as well, and someone must have brought him clothes because he was suddenly wearing pants as he knelt beside her, his large hands covering hers with a gentleness that seemed impossible from someone who had just torn through dozens of rogues with ruthless efficiency. And his voice, when he spoke, was rough with emotion and concern, and barely controlled fury at seeing his mate injured and exhausted and covered in blood. "Let me help," he said, and there was no command in his tone despite his position as Alpha King. No demand or expectation that she would obey, only an offer freely given and a desire to share her burden if she would allow it. And Celine found herself nodding because she was too tired to maintain her walls and too grateful for his presence to push him away, and too desperately in need of someone to lean on after carrying everything alone for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to have someone else share the weight of responsibility and fear and leadership. Together, they stabilized Theo enough to be moved to the pack hospital, and Demon's personal healer, who had apparently accompanied the rescue party because of course an Alpha King would have thought to bring medical support along with warriors, took charge of treating the most severely wounded with a competence and efficiency that made Celine realize that Demon had not just come to save her, but had come prepared to save her entire pack, had brought everything necessary to ensure that the wolves who depended on her would survive and recover and continue to thrive under her leadership. The hours that followed were a blur of coordinating recovery efforts and accounting for casualties and ensuring that every member of her pack was safe and cared for. And through it all, Damon remained at her side like a silver shadow, never taking over or undermining her authority with her own wolves, but always there to support and assist and offer suggestions when she was too exhausted to think clearly. And Selena realized with a clarity that felt like being struck by lightning that this was what partnership looked like. This was what having a mate meant. Not the weakness and distraction and vulnerability she had always feared, but a doubling of strength and resources and capability that made her more effective as an alpha rather than less. When the immediate crisis had been managed and her pack members were being treated and the dead had been honored and arrangements had been made for increased security and border patrols to prevent another attack, Celine finally allowed herself to stop moving and stop directing and stop being Alpha Celine Stormborn, who had to be strong and capable and invulnerable. And she sagged against the wall of her office with her eyes closed and her body shaking with exhaustion and delayed shock and emotions she had been suppressing for hours because she could not afford to feel them until her pack was safe. Demon caught her before she could slide down the wall into an undignified heap on the floor, and he carried her to her private quarters despite her weak protests that she was fine and could walk perfectly well on her own. And once they were behind closed doors where no one could see, and she did not need to maintain her alpha facade. Celine Stormborn finally broke down and cried for the first time since her parents had died 7 years ago, sobbed against Demon's chest while he held her and stroked her silver hair, and murmured words of comfort and reassurance that she barely heard through the storm of emotions that was finally being released after years of being bottled up behind walls that had just crumbled into dust. "I was wrong," she whispered when she could finally speak again, her voice hoarse from crying and raw with honesty and vulnerability that terrified her, but felt necessary in ways she could not quite articulate. "I was so wrong about everything, about thinking I had to be alone to be strong, about believing that accepting help meant accepting weakness, about rejecting you because I was afraid of losing you the way I lost my parents, and I nearly destroyed everything because of that fear, nearly got my pack killed because I was too stubborn and too proud to admit that I needed someone, that I needed you." Demon pulled back just enough to look into her amber eyes with his ice blue gaze that held no judgment or anger or triumph at her admission, only understanding and love and a patience that made her throat tight with emotions she could not name. And when he spoke, his voice was gentle, but absolutely certain in ways that left no room for doubt or fear or the walls she had spent so long constructing. "Your parents didn't die because they loved each other, Celine," he said, echoing the words Kira had spoken days earlier, but with an added weight that came from his own experience of loss and leadership and understanding what it meant to carry responsibility for hundreds of lives. "They died protecting their pack and their territory and their children, and they would be furious if they knew you were using their deaths as an excuse to deny yourself happiness and connection and the strength that comes from standing beside someone who loves you rather than always standing alone." He cupped her face in his large hands, his thumbs gently wiping away the tears that were still streaming down her cheeks, and continued with an intensity that made her wolf whimper with need and longing and the desperate desire to finally accept what had been offered from the beginning. "I am not asking you to give up your pack or your position or your independence. I am not demanding that you submit to me or become some decorative Luna who exists only to support my rule. I want a partner and an equal and someone who will stand beside me as a fellow alpha and help me lead not just your pack, but our combined territories. Because together, we could be unstoppable. Together, we could build something that would last for generations. Together, we could be what the moon goddess intended when she gave us both silver hair and alpha souls and a mate bond that refuses to break, no matter how hard you tried to reject it." The truth in his words settled into Celine's bones with a rightness that felt like coming home after a long journey through hostile territory, and she realized that she had been fighting the wrong battle all along, had been so focused on protecting herself from vulnerability that she had made herself vulnerable in entirely different ways, had been so determined to prove she did not need anyone that she had nearly lost everything she actually needed in order to survive and thrive and become the kind of leader her pack deserved. "I choose you," she said, and the words felt like a vow and a surrender and a claiming all at once. Felt like stepping off a cliff and trusting that he would catch her or that they would fall together. Felt like the bravest and most terrifying thing she had ever said in a life full of difficult choices and impossible situations. "I choose us. I choose the bond. I choose partnership over isolation and love over fear. And I am sorry it took me so long to understand that accepting you does not make me weak, but makes me stronger than I ever could have been alone." Demon's smile was radiant enough to light up the dim room, and he kissed her with a passion and tenderness that made the mate bond flare between them like wildfire, made her entire body sing with rightness and completion, and the sense that she had finally found something she had not even known she was missing. And when he marked her neck with his teeth, claiming her officially before the moon goddess, and sealing their bond in a way that could never be broken, or rejected, or denied, Celine marked him back with a fierceness that proclaimed to the world that she was claiming him just as surely as he was claiming her, that this was a partnership of equals, that neither of them would ever stand alone again as long as they both drew breath. The weeks and months that followed brought changes to both Stormcrest and the Northern Crown territories, as two powerful alphas learned to navigate leadership together and build something new from the foundation of respect and love and shared purpose. And Celine discovered that having a mate did not make her weaker or more distracted, but actually made her more effective as a leader, because she had someone to share the burden of decisions, and someone to offer perspective she might have missed, and someone who would catch her when she faltered and help her stand when she fell. They held a public claiming ceremony that was attended by alphas from across the territories, and if some of those alphas looked uncomfortable at the sight of a female alpha who refused to submit to her mate's authority, even as she wore his mark on her neck, well, that discomfort was something they would need to overcome, because Celine Stormborn had no intention of conforming to outdated expectations about how mated females should behave, or how leadership should be distributed between partners. Her pack flourished under the alliance with Demon's territories, gaining access to resources and protection and trade opportunities that would have been impossible for a small pack to obtain independently. But Celine maintained her position as Alpha of Stormcrest and made it clear that her wolves answered to her first and foremost, even as she stood beside Demon as his equal when matters affected both territories. And the arrangement worked because they had built it on mutual respect and trust, and a willingness to compromise without either of them sacrificing their essential nature or authority. Years later, when Celine stood in the gardens of the expanded Stormcrest packhouse, with her silver hair gleaming in the sunlight, and her twin daughters who had inherited both parents' distinctive coloring playing at her feet, she would look back on that night in the summit hall when she had rejected her mate out of fear and pride and wounded self-protection, and she would marvel at how close she had come to destroying her own happiness through sheer stubborn determination to remain invulnerable and alone. She had learned through pain and near disaster that true strength was not measured by how much you could carry alone, but by knowing when to accept help and when to share your burdens with someone who loved you enough to stand beside you through every challenge and every triumph. And that lesson had made her not just a better alpha, but a better wolf and a better person who could lead with both strength and compassion and the understanding that vulnerability freely chosen with the right person was the most powerful thing in the world. When young female alphas came to her seeking advice about leadership and relationships and the impossible balance between maintaining authority and accepting love, Celine would tell them her story without shame or regret, would share how she had rejected her mate and nearly lost everything before finally finding the courage to choose partnership over isolation. And she would watch as understanding dawned in their eyes and hope replaced the fear that so many young alphas carried like invisible weights on their shoulders. "The mate bond does not make you weak," she would tell them, while Demon stood nearby with their daughters and looked at her with the same love and devotion he had shown from the very beginning. "Rejecting it because you are afraid of weakness. That is what makes you weak. And I should know because I spent weeks living that mistake before I finally understood that the moon goddess does not give us mates to diminish us, but to complete us. Not to control us, but to stand beside us. Not to take away our strength, but to help us become everything we were meant to be. The rejected bond that would not break had become the foundation of everything good in her life. The partnership she had feared had become the source of her greatest strength, and the male she had tried to push away had become the person she trusted most in the entire world. And if that was not proof that the moon goddess knew what she was doing when she forged mate bonds between souls who were meant to complement each other, then Celine did not know what other evidence anyone could possibly need. She had been wrong about so many things, had been blind and stubborn, and so afraid of losing someone that she had nearly lost herself. But Demon had been right about one thing from the very beginning. She had been his from the moment their eyes met across that hall, and he had been hers, and no amount of rejection or fear or pride could change what the moon goddess had written in the stars long before either of them were born. And sometimes the bravest thing a wolf could do was stop running from destiny and accept with grace and gratitude the gifts they were given, even when those gifts came wrapped in challenges and required them to become stronger and braver and more vulnerable than they ever thought possible. So what did you think of Celine and Demon's story of rejection and redemption, of fear and courage, of learning that true strength comes not from standing alone, but from choosing to stand beside someone who makes you better than you could ever be by yourself? Did the moment when Celine finally called for Demon through the mate bond give you chills the way it gave me chills writing it? Could you feel the intensity of two silver-haired alphas learning to share power and leadership and love in ways that defied traditional expectations? I want to hear every single thought you have about this journey from rejection to acceptance, from isolation to partnership, from fear to love. So please leave me a comment below telling me what you loved most about this story. What moments made you hold your breath? What scenes made you want to reach through the screen and shake Celine for being so stubborn? And whether you would have made the same choices she made if you were in her position facing the terrifying vulnerability that comes with accepting a mate bond when you have spent years convincing yourself that you are better off alone. And if you enjoyed this tale of powerful alphas and fated bonds and the kind of love that refuses to be denied, no matter how hard someone tries to reject it, then please subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story about werewolves and mates and the beautiful complexity of finding your person in a world full of danger and duty and the impossible choices that come with leadership and love. Hit that notification bell so you will know the moment I post the next story, whether it is about rejected mates who find their way back to each other, about omega wolves who turn out to be far more powerful than anyone expected, about alpha kings who will stop at nothing to claim their destined partners, or about any of the other infinite variations of werewolf romance that explore what it means to love and be loved and fight for happiness, even when the world seems determined to keep you apart from the person the moon goddess created specifically for you. Your support means absolutely everything to me and helps me continue creating these stories that I pour my heart and soul into. So thank you for reading, thank you for being here, and I will see you in the next story where we will explore another corner of this world where wolves run under the moon, and destiny is not something you can outrun, no matter how fast you are or how determined you are to avoid it. Because some bonds are simply meant to be, and the sooner we accept that truth, the sooner we can stop fighting and start living the lives we were always meant to lead.